Episode 30, Resurrection and New Life. At the start of this series, we touched on ancient questions about life after death and cosmic justice. We explored the human existential need for forgiveness and reconciliation between individuals, within communities, and with God. We saw how some of those needs are met in ritual practices within and beyond the Jewish tradition. The narratives of passion and resurrection that we have been exploring present the foundational Christian experience of a God who intervenes in history to transform that human situation once and for all. In the person of Jesus Christ, truly part of human history, but also living and transcendent, human needs for forgiveness and reconciliation are definitively met, and questions of life, death, and justice are divinely answered. The language the New Testament authors use to articulate and explain this Christian experience belongs to the thought world of the Roman Hellenistic era. There were common, overlapping cosmologies. There was a range of overlapping beliefs about the human self and its transcendent possibilities. That allowed the New Testament writers to express a salvation narrative rooted in the Jewish scriptures, but still in a language accessible to men and women from other traditions. Christianity evolved within the Roman Empire and separated off from the Jewish communities from which it originated. As it did so, a difference of emphasis emerged between the Latin-speaking West and the Greek-speaking East. From the start, the Christian salvation story looks in two directions. One way looks towards the present realities of life in this world, to the cross and forgiveness of sins, salvation from. The other looks beyond to the promise of the resurrection, to everlasting life, salvation for. The Latin tradition has often tended to look more in the first direction, dealing with a sinful present. But the classical Greek-speaking theologians often place more emphasis on future human destiny, on theosis, becoming divine. We've spent the last few episodes exploring salvation from in the Western tradition. But what about salvation for? How do modern thinkers deal with the notion of life everlasting and the biblical concept of resurrection of the body? Let's take a dip into that theological journey and return to some of the themes we explored way back in Series 2. Thomas Aquinas, you might remember, gave an account of the human journey from death to the afterlife that tried to integrate the narrative beliefs itemized in the Christian creed with the best science of the day. He followed and modified the Aristotelian tradition, as reworked by the Arabic commentators Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd. Aquinas follows Aristotle's biological understanding of the soul. The human soul is naturally embodied. It is what makes the human body a living body. To be a human being is to be a combination of body and soul, just like any other animal. However, the human soul has a unique dimension in comparison with those other animals. Like them, the soul is embedded in sense organs through which it interacts with the physical world. But the human soul also has something more. It has intelligence or reason, which allows it to understand and grasp non-physical realities. Intelligence puts humans in a special relationship with God. Human nous or logos is an image of the divine nous or logos, the divine word introduced at the beginning of John's Gospel. Because of reason or intelligence, humans will be able one day to delight in contemplating a God who is beyond the physical world for all eternity. So the human soul has a non-physical, eternal dimension. Because of this, unlike the other animals, it can separate from the earthly body at death and await the gift of a new resurrection body at the time of the new creation, when time will come to an end and all creation be made new. However, humans will not be complete as persons until they receive that new resurrection body. Whether citizens of this world or the next, humans are not just soul. They are body and soul. In the time between death and resurrection, human souls are incomplete persons, awaiting their completion. Notice how careful Aquinas is to integrate his scientific, analytical account of resurrection with the Christian narrative. The Christian tradition, like the Muslim and Jewish traditions, is very specific. Resurrection of the body and life everlasting. Now, there has always been a great deal of enthusiasm for Aquinas as the great thinker of Catholic Christianity. This is partly because Pope Leo XIII named him as the go-to theologian when he was trying to revive Catholic theology at the end of the 19th century. And it's also because he was a bit of a genius. In spite of that, the modern Catechism of the Catholic Church, produced in 1994, does not use Thomas's full-blooded account when it discusses resurrection of the body and life everlasting. It does reference scriptural narrative, along with the sayings of the ancient church fathers and official church documents. But it avoids trying to talk about the physics. Instead, it quotes from the document of the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes. That's the one that talks about the relationship of the church to the modern world. We know neither the moment of the consummation of the earth and of humanity, nor the way in which the universe will be transformed. The form of this world, distorted by sin, is passing away, and we are taught that God is preparing a new dwelling and a new earth in which righteousness dwells, in which happiness will fill and surpass all the desires of peace arising in the hearts of humankind. The fathers of the council step back from offering an official, analytical, scientific definition, and instead point back to intuitive, narrative teaching embodied in the tradition. Notice the modesty about what official teaching can properly affirm and what language it can properly use. That modesty has good philosophical and scientific grounds. There have been big leaps forward in cosmology, chemistry, physics, and evolutionary biology since the 17th century. These have left classical Aristotelian physics behind, so Thomas's explanation cannot work in the same way as when Aristotle's universe was standard science. But there is a philosophical challenge to what Thomas was doing, which is even more significant for the 20th century Catholic theologians who contributed to the Second Vatican Council. Thomas was following in the footsteps of Ibn Sina and Aristotle and Plato before him. He was making speculative deductions about the way the transcendent realm must be on the basis of relatively slim evidence from the world of experience. If you want to get a taste of where that style of argument can lead, try Gottfried Leibniz's monadology. Leibniz there tries to suggest that the real transcendent world consists of intelligent monads interacting in a pre-established harmony, which gives rise to the world of our daily experience. David Hume, writing in the middle years of the 18th century, challenged this whole style of philosophizing. First, he argued that our knowledge is derived from concepts entirely dependent on what we can see and touch. Second, those concepts rooted in experience cannot give us any additional knowledge beyond that of the experience itself. Hume's inquiries are worth exploring if you want more detail than this crude summary. What's important for our story is that Hume's perspective caused the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who had been as speculative as Leibniz in his early career, to change his tune. Kant now accepted that the concepts which we use to interpret the world, we can see, touch, and so on, cannot be extended beyond that world to talk about the transcendent. However, he did not want to go as far as Hume, who effectively wrote the transcendent out of the philosopher's script. He wanted to allow us humans some access to a knowledge that takes us beyond the physical world. Kant's theory allows us to have knowledge of two sets of things. The first set comprises the objects and events of the world of the senses. These provide the raw materials of scientific knowledge. The second set are the concepts that must be embedded in our consciousness if we are to have any experience of a world out there at all. This second layer of knowledge makes space for knowledge of non-material truths, like the truths of arithmetic and geometry, and for the high-level concepts that make scientific explanation possible, like laws of cause and effect. It also makes space for ethical knowledge that is more than just feelings. He calls this transcendental knowledge because it is not directly about the world. It goes beyond physical things to the non-physical features of our consciousness that must be there. The realities around the edges of the world which allow us to know it. That's a very thin layer of transcendence, though, in comparison with what went before. There can be no direct proofs for the existence of God, because the 5 ways summarized by Aquinas make illegitimate use of concepts that only have meaning in the physical world, though Kant does offer an indirect one, based on the human experience of morality and our logical expectation of justice. It is important to note that Kant didn't stop believing in transcendent reality. He just claimed we couldn't know it, except, and this is a very important except for later Catholic theology, except for the thin layer of transcendence accessible to us humans when we explore the inner space of consciousness which makes our experience possible. Some of the key theologians who were advising the bishops on their documents at the Second Vatican Council, especially the German speakers, had spent their careers wrestling with the challenge Kant offered for philosophical theology in the classical style. Kant's challenge gave a deep philosophical reason to be wary about using the language of science, which describes the world we can see, to develop theories about a transcendental realm that we can't see. That left 2 routes for trying to make sense of a world beyond the world. One was simply to trust in the robustness of the language of the narrative inherited through the tradition. We can take it as human cultural reality, valid in its own terms, trusting in the reliability of revelation. And we don't worry too much about physics or about theories of knowledge. That seems to be the sort of route taken by Hans Urs von Balthasar. There is a second option, though, and this is to take up Kant's challenge and explore that inner space of human consciousness. Is it possible to find some handholds for classical scholastic theology in that narrow space? The philosopher Martin Heidegger started life training for the Catholic priesthood and knew his Aquinas. But when he began exploring the conditions for human consciousness in the 1920s, his answer was a no. For him, the human way of being is fundamentally bounded by death, and that fact is ever present as a horizon on the edges of awareness. Within that horizon, the human is challenged to exercise true freedom, to grasp their authentic selves. However, his doctoral student Karl Rahner found there was another way of looking at that horizon. Yes, accept that humans are time-bound, limited by death. But the horizon of the free human person is a horizon of possibility, offering an intimation of the infinite possibility of God. A human life open to that holy mystery is open to grace and the possibility of free self-gift, authentic generosity, a life lived with authentic value. This constant background openness to an unseen yet present transcendence comes into awareness in moments of grace and goodness in daily life. Jesus, as incarnate Son of God, is the human being utterly and completely open to that transcendence. In his person, the transcendent God becomes visible in history. For Rahner, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus together form the ultimate divine message that all our human selves have been waiting to hear. By engaging with this person who reveals the hidden God, ordinary humans are released in grace to live lives of authentic value. When Rana talks about life beyond death, he fuses the existential language of Heidegger with the traditional language of the timeless God. A human life that has pursued authentic value is completed at death. But the afterlife is not a continuation in time. It is not more of the same. The complete life is now a whole, present before God in a timeless eternity. That is something of what Rana says in his book, Basic Course in the Faith, in long and rather tricky German sentences. But notice how he approaches the question. He keeps some bits of the tradition of Thomas, an afterlife of timeless consciousness, fully open to the mystery of God. But other bits he leaves in the background, questions about the nature of a resurrection body. Notice too how he makes use of the existentialist themes that dominate continental philosophy in the middle years of the 20th century. Human freedom is exercised against the tragic background of mortality in a quest for self-realization and authenticity. What he is trying to do, and people still argue about whether he succeeded or not, is to show that all humans carry a fundamental openness to transcendence. Created by God, they have an awareness, as it were in their peripheral vision, of that holy mystery and their own immortality. So humans can legitimately accept the narratives of the resurrection of Christ without breaking Kant's rules. Even though that event is unique in human history, his story is the completion of a human story that each human already knows in that thin, transcendent realm of the things we know without always being aware of them. If that seemed a bit opaque, it's not your fault. It's a tricky one to make sense of, and my take on it may not have helped. But Rana gives a useful example of how to accept the limit Kant places on what we can legitimately say about the transcendent, while still saying something significant. The Christian message about the afterlife is not talking illegitimately about things that are entirely unknowable. That gives a bit more context for those words from the Second Vatican Council quoted in the Catechism. We know neither the moment of the consummation of the earth and of humanity, nor the way in which the universe will be transformed. We don't know the when or the how, but we are still entitled to talk about it and claim some sort of reliable, though limited, knowledge. Let's go back to the other reason for 20th century caution over attempts to blend salvation narrative and physical science. The problem that physical science itself is constantly being revised. You have to be cautious about hitching your theological commitments to a scientific theory that may one day be abandoned or significantly modified. Teilhard de Chardin developed a bold attempt to reconcile evolutionary thinking with the Christian narrative of salvation. He had a cosmic vision of the whole universe evolving towards completion in the cosmic Christ, described in the letter to the Colossians. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Self-conscious matter, guided towards Christ by the Spirit, forms in ever higher and more complex structures. When the time is ripe, the incarnate Christ unites creation to the divine, so that after a final phase of evolution, all persons can be fulfilled in Christ in the great unity of consciousness that preserves the individuality of all, the communion of saints. Teilhard's vision didn't neatly fit mainstream theology, and his texts were banned until the 50s, after his death. Nevertheless, when they were made available, a lot of scientifically minded Christians found them very helpful. It enabled them to reconcile their faith with 20th century science. Teilhard's vision relied on an idea popular in early 20th century scientific thought, that some form of consciousness was intrinsic to even the simplest form of matter, explaining the emergence of higher order life forms through the drive of a life force. Unfortunately, as Teilhard's writings were released, the life force theory was being superseded by the more mechanical theory of genetic Darwinism, based on the chemistry of DNA. By the early 80s, consciousness was being explained by philosophers like Daniel Dennett not as a fundamental feature of all matter, but as an accidental byproduct of blind software-like processes that help embodied genes replicate ever more effectively. So if you are a modern transhumanist looking for immortality, you don't need to look for religious narratives. If our minds, ourselves, are software running on the hardware of the brain, then one day when our technology is sophisticated enough, it would be possible to upload those cells from this mortal body of flesh and bone into a bright, shiny, high-tech one that will last a lot longer. And some tech-minded Christians are happy to embrace a version of this as a plausible way of integrating belief in the resurrection of the body with our current understanding of physics and widely held beliefs about the nature of the human self. The mainstream Catholic tradition resists such a reductive account of what it means to be a person. It aligns more closely with recent movements to recover that early 20th century understanding of the human person as an irreducible reality within the physical world, even though that does not fit perfectly with the classical medieval model of the soul. Currently in eco-theology, some thinkers are picking up on this and are reanimating the sort of language Teilhard used. They want to do justice to the idea that the whole of creation will be redeemed, as Paul suggests in a letter to the Romans. The whole of creation has been groaning in an act of giving birth. In the concept of deep incarnation, incarnation is not just about God becoming human, but is about God becoming material, physical. The whole dynamism of the natural world becomes integrated into the life of God. Thomas's beautified physical world, frozen in an eternally present gaze towards God, is missing the dynamism and energy of gravitational fields, volcanoes, plant and animal life. Its static Aristotelian realities, blended of form and matter, miss out on the real-world flow of energy through physical forms that are often more like waves. The high-tech immortality of the transhumanists casts the natural world off as a hindrance in a strange search for perfection that dispenses with the world from which it came. The software self, which is only a weird sort of illusion anyway, can happily dissolve and merge with the blind iterations of an immortal AI. But something important about being human seems lost in that picture. It is hard for us not to want modern science and philosophy to provide at least space for the Christian narrative of afterlife. But if it is to do more, if it is both to affirm the possibility and nourish the imagination, it needs to provide a vision that makes space for the recognizably human, the dynamism we find in the celebratory biblical images, a great heavenly liturgy, a kingdom of justice, the marriage feast, a song of all creation. But let's go back to the Rana insight, that our understanding of resurrection and afterlife comes from what we already know as humans. The Catechism affirms, following Paul, that in the Christian understanding, the life of the resurrection is already tangible. Forgiveness and freedom in grace are part of present experience. And the living relationship between Christians and the risen one means that every free movement of growth towards goodness and justice, individual and communal, is a real symbol of what the fully redeemed universe is to become. That's partly what Rana was trying to capture, I think. As ever, things make most sense in theology when we leave the rocky paths of abstraction and analysis and bathe in the richness of personal experience. Paul doesn't preach a textbook. He preaches Christ crucified. Christianity, like any other faith tradition, begins and ends in a personal encounter with the Holy Mystery. Resurrection is there to be glimpsed in what happens now, in the experience of grace. Words can only get us so far on the road to salvation.